There is a place humans rarely imagine, a vault of things that should never have been lost to time, not just relics and bones, but tools that touch the way a life is ordered. Mike Palmer first learned of that possibility the night the desert gave up a secret. He was a man who worked with his hands because it steadied him, a carpenter by trade, a fixer of doors and the quiet things people hardly notice until they fail. For 20 years he built tables that outlived the families who owned them, cabinets that smelled faintly of pine and promise. But there was a pattern beneath his skill, a weathered groove in his days that felt almost like a pre-written instruction. Every time money arrived clean and bright, some old script in him loosened a knot. A sudden diagnosis for a child he befriended, a truck that died at daybreak, a client who disappeared the moment his work began to look like a brand. Prosperity arrived, then vanished, not by theft or headline scandal, but by 1,000 small betrayals he performed himself. Giving away a job to a friend, making a discount he didn't need to make, signing a contract badly for fear of insulting a client. Years of trying to be reasonable had become the engine of his ruin. His ex-wife had left because she could no longer explain the holes in the bank account. His creditors learned his name, his pride learned humility. He told himself it was conditioning, bad choices, learned unworthiness. He fixed things for neighbors while his own bank balance fell through the floor. He slept with a small stack of past-due notices like a talisman of shame. The word curse made him bristle, but late at night, when sleep didn't come, he would whisper, "Why does abundance never stick?" The answer, he would come to believe, began with a sound like tearing glass that lit the sky over the back road to his workshop. The crash happened at midnight, a comet of white and blue that struck the dry basin half a mile off the highway. Mike was heading home after a late job. An interior designer had finally called back with changes for the vanity he had built. He had money in his wallet for once. The thought of sleep felt luxuriously near. The light surprised him. He braked and watched a shape tumble end over end across the sage until it burned out into a heap of blackened metal. He walked toward it with the same attention he used on a warped board, looking for the give, the fracture, the point that would tell him how to restore it. The craft was wrong in ways that made his ribs ache, and outer skin like hammered pearl, ribs like the inside of a mollusk. A smell that was metallic and green, like a storm passing through copper. When he got close, the thing that crawled out of the wreck was smaller than he expected. It moved with a fragile patience. One of its limbs kept collapsing. It made no sound anyone else would call a voice. Instead, there was a bloom of meaning that settled against his skull like a hand.
"Do not fear," the thought said, directly and without words. The sensation had weight. Mike tasted iron. He half laughed, the laughter of a man who had followed odd instincts before and reached out. Saving it was not heroic. He dragged a piece of the charred shell away, found a crease in the hull that opened to reveal a small wrapped bundle. The creature's eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark as river stones and watched with deliberate focus. Mike scooped the bundle up and, without thinking of anything but the immediate task, drove the damaged thing back to his garage with it in the passenger seat. At home he set it on the workbench and fumbled for towels because that was what men like him did when no one else was around. They made do. He found a leather pouch inside the bundle, a soft, well-worn thing stitched with a thread of a material he could not name. The creature, the alien, he began to think, because he had no better word, moved with the kind of dignity that makes old farmers and old animals seem holy. It touched the pouch with a trembling limb, and the moment its skin met leather there was another thought, not spoken but present. "Thank you. There is debt." The telepathy was not a language he understood and then translated. It arrived as mood and intention, precise as a carpenter's measurement. "You saved me," the thought conveyed. "I cannot repay you the way humans think of repayment. There is an exchange of knowledge. The pouch is mine. It is a priest's kit. It contains things my people kept when they walked among yours." Mike stared at the object as if it might sprout legs and walk away. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a few items that did not belong in any museum he had ever visited, and yet felt ancient in the bone-deep way old wood smells. A crystal cylinder the length of his palm, its inner surface curving like a braided river. A small metallic disc, pitted with tiny symbols he couldn't place, and beneath them, folded in a black cloth, a small round mirror no larger than a pocket watch. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his bench and kept the creature on the floor where his dog, who had left his life years ago and now returned to sniff at the stranger, would not get underfoot. Hours passed like a long plank. The alien did not speak in words. It communicated in intention and images. It showed him a place they called, in translation, a museum. Not a museum of plaques and rope barriers, but a repository of things that recorded and preserved social technologies and energetic tools. It told by impression and a few broken words Mike could piece together that certain human powers had kept such artifacts in secret caches for their own reasons. Governments, collectors of influence, custodians of control. The alien's presentation of this was tentative and rumor-like, as if it were telling a story about a stranger he once met.
The word secret base emerged as an image, an underground hall lined with objects that recorded human intentions and vows, catalogued and guarded in silence. These are his claims, Mike told himself later, because later he needed to keep one foot in skepticism. This is how he explained it. The alien's explanation about Anunnaki, a name it offered and then translated as mythic lineages, an archetype of makers in their stories, came with the give and take of memory, legend, testimony, the vocabulary of a species that had watched human cultures like a gardener watches sprouts. None of it was proof in a scientific sense. It was experience, relayed through a being who had no reason to lie and every physical incentive to survive. When the alien, who for lack of a better identifier Mike started thinking of simply as he, put the mirror in Mike's hands, the metal was warm. It was not polished like a modern mirror. It did not reflect his face. Instead, it looked like a pool at dawn, depth without surface, a light that rolled without source. It shows not the face, but the layers beneath, the alien conveyed as a feeling, an instruction rendered as an urge to be careful. In Mike's experience, the mirror did not show pictures like a movie. It unfolded memory like slats of a barn door, one sliding over the other. The first glimpses were close and gritty, the sound of sand, the lash of humility and duty, a narrow room lit only by candles. He felt his own chest compress with a foreign grief that was also uncannily familiar. He recognized hands that carried rosaries and a face that had once been his, but belonged to a man who wore a habit. The Franciscan came first. It was the most recent of the lives the mirror revealed. In those seconds, Mike tasted old incense and iron. He saw himself cross his hands and take a vow with a voice full of conviction. I renounce wealth. The moment stretched wide in the mirror. He felt the vow like a cord tightening around an ankle. There was praise, yes, and there was a sharp moral purity that turned wealth into spectacle and temptation into sin. He could see the monks' faces, the way they placed bread on the table and watched others eat it with a sense that such deprivation purified them. The vow had been made not in cruelty, but in fervor, an honest attempt to live a life of service, and that honesty made it stubborn. Honesty, the mirror insisted, is what binds memory most tightly. Beneath that life was another. The surface changed from candlelight to the shimmer of river mud and papyrus. He was a scribe in the court of a ruler whose identity the mirror painted only in the impression of gold and reed pens. He refused tribute. He declined to take the royal seal. In his refusal, he said something like, I will not hold wealth that distracts me from the truth. His face in that life was older, patient as stone. He wrote histories, and the king offered him favors. He turned them down because, in his mind, to accept them would mean becoming complicit in a system that exploited others. The resolution was ethical, not ascetic. Still, the refusal carried the same electromagnetic signature as the monastic poverty. The vow there congealed as if pinned into a layer of his being. Older still was an image of thin breath and high mountains. A man lay on straw, eyes clouded, a thin smile like a last admission. He told his companions, "Let my family be spared from wealth. Bind my name from riches." He called it a protection for those he loved, a shield from greed and division. It was a blessing, offered like a lit candle to keep darkness at bay. Only the next image, deeper and more shadowed, suggested that the blessing had turned into a trap. A mortal's act to protect kin had rebounded into a compulsion his later selves could not see how to refuse. The mirror's sequence moved backward through lives like a tide receding. Each life was small in its own temporal space, a compression of the decisive moment, not a full biography. The thread that stitched them together was a vow, stated clearly and then folded into the soul as if into a pocket. In different times and faiths, the words took different shapes, but the underlying grammar was the same, a conscious, energetic decree against abundance. Each was made with intention, and intention, the mirror suggested, writes into the subtle tissues of being. Mike's head hurt in that garage as each layer collapsed back into his palms. Memory is contagious. He felt an ache that was not his own physical ailment, but the ghost of a vow made by someone with different eyes and the same resolve. He remembered being small, taking a job and then sabotaging a phone call so a rival would get the contract. He remembered lying to a potential client about costs and then hating himself in the quiet between breaths. The mirror answered the question that had gnawed at him for years. These acts were not random, they were repetitions of ancient choices. "These are claims of experience," the alien transmitted, the urge now a steady presence. "The mirror reveals layers. You may accept it as truth, as a story, or as a pattern. It is yours to test." Mike kept his skepticism like a pocket knife. He had to, life demanded it. But something else had opened inside him, a space that felt less like being cursed and more like being bound by a rope you had never seen until someone pointed it out. The mirror did not say the rope was unbreakable. The alien did not promise salvation. He offered a method and said, not as law but as invitation, that vows recorded in the soul can be acknowledged, honored for their original purpose, and then consciously released. When the alien used the word Anunnaki, it did so in the soft cadence of a storyteller trying to translate a myth into a language built of fewer syllables. Anunnaki, he conveyed, is the word your people have used to name architects of knowledge. In our stories, they were makers and stewards. The pouch is a priest's kit, a set of tools used to read the record and sometimes alter it. Mike heard the name and felt the hair at his neck rise, because names carry gravity. The creature did not claim modern archaeological fact. It relayed meaning as memory. It said that across many worlds, and by that the alien meant stars and spheres Mike had not visited except in late-night documentaries, certain objects were kept by caretakers who believed that knowledge had dangerous consequences when released without responsibility. There were museums, the alien conveyed, places like vaults and caves and hidden rooms where artifacts that could alter how humans think and behave were catalogued. Guardians, not always kind, kept them. Powers on Earth, governments or institutions with reach and secrecy, had learned to track and sometimes accumulate these objects. The alien's description was not an accusation. It was a narrative painted with the faint brush of distance. We observed, we catalogued, We hid. Mike's mind, used to measuring planks and load-bearing walls, tried to fit this into a frame it could handle. If there existed tools that could reveal and change the knot of a life, if there existed devices that preserved moral choices as energetic traces, then the idea that humans would hoard such technology made grim sense. Information is power. Tools that could influence desire would call to controllers. The image of a secret base was now not myth, but an ugly, useful possibility. A place where artifacts sat, known but inaccessible, their potential left to whoever could interpret them. He thought of the leather pouch in his hands and felt suddenly like a pawn who had stumbled onto the king's message. The creature, fragile, injured, luminous in a way that had nothing to do with its skin, asked for quiet repayment. A debt, it said. If you help me, I will teach you to read what binds you. The exchange was not supernatural in the theatrical sense. It was, the alien conveyed, an ethical reciprocity in the architecture of his people. They helped each other unbind fetters when they had the means. By morning, the garage smelled of solder and old coffee. Mike had gone through the pouch 3 times, feeling like an archaeologist and a fool in equal measure. He called Jeff, his friend, and an artist who had kept a small circle of nonsense where Mike could unload his oddities. Jeff came over with a thermos and a cigarette. He peered at the mirror with professional disbelief and then with fascination. "You sure this isn't some prop?" he asked. "It felt like it was looking back," Mike said. The memory of the monk's vow sat like a pebble under his tongue. He told Jeff about the pattern, the way he always folded money into someone else's hands, and about the crash that had started it all. Jeff laughed, then did not laugh. He looked at the alien with the frank, greedy curiosity artists have for anything that shimmers between myth and experience. "If it's true, if there are artifacts out there, you can see why people would hide them," he said. "Power loves to keep its toys." He did not say governments by name. He used the softer term, people with power. But even that small avoidance carried the implication the title asked the listener to hold. Someone keeps these things away. There was a soft, necessary CTA that night, the kind you slip into a conversation because the tale is too heavy and you want others to sit with you. If this story grabs you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. It was a tiny, practical step, not a spell or an oath, a way to tell others that this thread might be worth following. Mike wasn't thinking about subscribers. He was thinking about whether a life could be changed by naming the source of its sabotage. He took the mirror to the workbench and, at the alien's suggestion, touched it to his chest. The contact was not ritual in the ornamental sense. It was an act of attention. The alien's method, as he would later explain in more clinical terms, was a threefold approach: recognition, validation, release. He said the words like a teacher proposing homework. First, acknowledge the vow and the lives that shaped it. Second, honor the original purpose behind that vow, the protection or purity it once intended. Third, choose to dissolve it properly so it no longer governs present action. The alien did not describe guarantees, only procedure and intent. Many have reported relief, he suggested, nuance woven into his telepathic tone. I can show you how to begin. You will do the rest. Mike imagined the life he might live if the old automatic gestures, gifting away a contract, underpricing himself to avoid offending someone, loosened like an old knot. He imagined paying his bills on time without the gnawing ritual of guilt. He imagined for the first time in years making a decision based on thriving rather than not hurting someone else. But the mirror had taught him the opposite lesson too. These vows often began with something noble and turned sour only because they were never revisited. They were like promises made by a person at a different station in life, left unattended to accumulate weight. These are experiential claims, Mike told Jeff aloud, because the line between wonder and credulity felt thin and he needed to mark it. What the creature says, that vows can be recorded and that this mirror shows them, that's his report. We can take it as a thing to test." Jeff scoffed softly, then reached for the mirror. When his fingers brushed the surface, his jaw unclenched and the cigarette fell from his lips. He saw something in the glass and swallowed.
He had grown used to surviving in smaller ways than Mike. Art shows that flopped, grants that promised and then evaporated. Yet the image that touched him was heavy, a childhood decision to burn family portraits so a parent would not be harassed by a past lover. His hand shook. "If this is what it claims," he said slowly, "then what they hid makes sense. People who understand states of mind and memory would want to archive that." The conversation turned easily to the alien's description of the museum. Not every society would call it a museum, the creature explained, but every society had custodians. On some worlds, the custodians used the artifacts to instruct, to remember. On others, they locked them away for convenience and power. "Why would governments hide such things?" Jeff asked aloud. The alien conveyed a thought that felt like cool water. Because tools that can influence desire and fate are more dangerous than weapons. Because a populace that can rewrite its programming could rearrange the balance of power. Because knowledge, once public, lowers barriers. Mike's mind darted to a million conspiracy-rich images, secret bunkers, and whispered deals, but the alien's tone kept him from leaping to headlines. This was a sober observation, not a press release. These things were monitored, they were tracked. Sometimes they were stored with bureaucratic neatness in offices and basements. Other times they were moved like smuggled seeds, kept off maps. The important claim, as relayed to Mike, was not the scandal, but the implication. There are mechanisms in the world that keep certain knowledge out of reach. The mirror in his hand was a thread that might lead to a broader web. Whether that web included institutions with names and budgets or shadowy collectors in private vaults was less important than the fact that there were guardians. "You hear that?" Jeff said, voice low. "If the world has things like this—" He let the sentence droop into silence like the end of a nail. At dawn, Mike slept for an hour on his workbench, his head on a folded sweater. The alien rested in the shadows, small and quiet, watched by the dog who had decided it was not a threat. When he woke, there was a new steadiness in him, not the deathly calm of resignation, but the clear focus a man gets when a plan becomes possible. Recognition first, he thought. If vows are binding, then naming them is the first step. He owed himself at least that much. He made a list, the kind that was more ritual than administration. Check the mirror, trace the pattern, and ask whether each act of self-denial had an origin that could be named. He wrote down the moments he could recall, the year he undercut a competitor, the time he gave away a job to a cousin, the night he turned over an invoice without reading it because he assumed he didn't deserve more. He wrote them not with shame, but with the mechanical tenderness of a carpenter noting cracks. Take measurement before you repair. Know the warp before you plane it down. The alien, who still moved with the patient economy of someone used to being handled by slow hands, offered more than a single method. It proposed that the mirror worked best when accompanied by physical gestures, a hand over the heart to anchor, 3 breaths to clear the head, a declaration spoken aloud to mark the end. He gave those details not in a way that demanded obedience, but as instruction for a practice. They were not incantations, they were actions that created focus, like a bow to start a play. One line of warning, the alien transmitted one night as Mike sat with the objects laid out like tools on a bench. Do not mistake an experience for universal law. This is a technique from my people's lore. It works as a method for those who engage intentionally. It is not a cure for medical or psychological conditions. Use it with care. Seek professional help if needed. Mike felt relief at the line.
He had no desire to drift into anything that felt like superstition or cultish promise. He wanted to test a method and see if the old pattern loosened. He also felt a wariness. Knowledge changes you. Teaching someone how to untie a knot is different from handing them a rope and telling them to cut it. The idea that such tools existed and that they had been tracked and stored by powers left a new kind of vertigo behind his eyes. If governments and custodians had long kept such things, then whole swaths of human history might be shaped differently. The hook of it was not so much that secrets were hidden, secrets existed in plenty, but that the hidden thing altered the human script, a vow that shaped generations, an artifact that could surface old patterns and possibly erase them. Mike felt a private rage at the thought of people hoarding instruments that might reopen closed circuits of people's lives, not because he believed in immediate revolution, but because the ethics of knowledge felt violated. If a piece of metal or crystal could show a vow that had held a life in thrall, who had the right to keep that information out of reach? The alien's narrative presented guardianship both as caretaking and as control. Some custodians were kind, many were not. Our species argued about it. The ambiguity settled over Mike like dust. He thought of his old clients and neighbors. He thought about the ways small kindnesses had been weaponized into penury. He thought of teaching, of how knowledge might ripple if offered gently. A neighbor who finally stopped underpricing his work and paid his rent on time. A friend who learned through recognition that his generosity was a cover for avoidance. The possibility of ripple effects became more than a thought. It was a moral project. That afternoon he set the mirror in the light and watched his own face in it, not as a reflection, but as a map. The alien's telepathic hand guided him through a simple first experiment. Name the pattern, feel it, speak the original intention out loud, and then set an intention to no longer be bound. The method read like a 3-step recipe: recognition, validation, release. He wrote the words on a scrap of wood because words anchored him better when they had weight. Recognition. Acknowledge the vow and the pattern that follows you. Validation. Honor the original motive that made the vow. Protection, service, purity, so it does not remain a distorted ghost. Release. Declare a conscious decision to let it go, not with contempt for its origin, but with gratitude for its service and a permission to move on. The alien did not provide a magic formula, and he was explicit about that. In our practice, intention matters more than words, he conveyed. Energy follows attention, but attention also requires honesty. When one recognizes and validates, release becomes ethical. He was careful with the language. He offered no promises. He offered a method and the authority of a tradition, which is all any teacher can do. Mike tried the gestures alone that evening. Hand over heart, 3 breaths as the alien suggested, and a simple statement meant to mark the intention. He felt silly at first, as if he had been handed an actor's cue. But on the 3rd breath, a peculiar thing happened. It was not a thunderbolt or a cinematic untying of chains. It was a loosening, almost like the let-out of a shoe after a long trek. The tightness in his chest that had been present while paying bills, the quiet dread that had been an undercurrent, slid like a shadow back from the edges. He did not leap onto the phone and call a banker. He did not lope out into the sunlight shouting about how the world had been saved. He sat very still and listened to the garage. The dog snored. The alien, whose face had the serene geometry of something not intended to be judged by human standards, watched him with something like curiosity and relief. It had asked for help and given help without coercion. The exchange felt ethically clean. But Mike was not naive. Change in the inner world did not always translate into immediate, tidy outcomes in the outer one. Old patterns had teeth, and habits were like old nails hammered deep into wood. He understood this because his life had been a slow lesson in consequences.
He decided, without fanfare, to test the shift. He would not, he told himself, use the mirror as a ticket to instant riches. He would use it as a diagnostic tool and then proceed with the slow work of choices that matched his new intention. At the back of his mind lay the larger question: if an object could reveal and potentially alter the scaffolding of human behavior, who else might know of such tools?
The alien had hinted, not in conspiracy theory flourish, but in the sad patience of an archivist, that human institutions sometimes collected these artifacts, and in collecting, created imbalances. Some custodians hid them as if they were hazardous materials. Some kept them for study. Some used them to influence. That idea lodged like a splinter. A secret base of objects could explain other mysteries: why certain ideas remained dominant, why certain behaviors seemed to repeat across generations, why power sometimes seemed to have a curiously durable hold. If whoever controlled these artifacts could shape vows and desires, then the social contract was not only political or legal, but energetic. The furniture of society, law, currency, customs, could be manipulated at a level no census accounted for. The alien's voice, always cautious when it spoke of human institutions, offered a final, soft image before that day's light faded to blue. An underground hall, arranged like a library, in which objects hummed faintly, each a record of a decision or a technology meant to steer a life. Guardians policed the catalog, checking it like librarians checking out a dangerous book. We too had custodians, the alien conveyed. We learned the hardness of giving and the hardness of withholding. Mike went to bed that night with the mirror under his pillow, not as a talisman, but as a question. He dreamed of a tunnel lined with small glass boxes, each containing a life. He woke with the taste of mud and melted candle wax in his mouth. The pattern in him pulsed like an old habit. He had taken the first step by naming it. That night, he decided, he would not share the mirror widely. Some things, he thought, deserved discretion. But he also thought of a life where a friend could stop undermining himself. He imagined, with a small, brave pulse of hopefulness, teaching Jeff the ritual and watching the ripple move outward like a series of little doors opening. The narrative was now double-edged: personal repair and a hint at a broader archive of secrets. If governments, if the powers that be, tracked such things, then the implications of his private work were not merely local. A single freed vow might not unseat a vault, but it might, the alien suggested, be a thread strong enough to begin a conversation. Knowledge, once circulating, refused to remain contained. That thought cut two ways. On one hand, there was the danger that knowledge could be weaponized by unscrupulous hands. On the other hand, there was the ethic that knowledge withheld often hurts those who most need it. Mike's anger at the idea of secrecy grew not into conspiracy-fueled mania, but into a quiet resolve to use what he had found with care. He did not yet know how to begin the conversation beyond a handful of friends. He did not know whether he would go looking for the museum the alien had described. For now, there was work to do in his own life, tests to run, choices to make, the small experiments of everyday bravery. The mirror suggested possibility, and possibility was a dangerous, necessary thing. When a crisis came, it would test the loosened knot in him. The first part of his story would end not with a salvo, but with a choice: to act on the new knowledge or to slip back into the comfortable rust of old behavior. The alien had offered instruction and a caution. The mirror had shown the rope. It was up to him to decide whether to cut it. He kept the pouch in his toolbox, and after the morning's light, wrapped it in cloth and placed it inside a locked drawer. Outside, the desert lay smooth and unsuspecting.
Inside, a man who had always measured his life in planks and angles had begun to measure it in vows. The secret base, whether a myth, an alien's tale, or an uncomfortable possibility, had become not merely a headline, but a kind of context for his own life. The idea that powers had hidden knowledge felt less like a political accusation and more like an ethical imperative. If such things exist, how do you steward them? At noon, a client called back and asked to see a portfolio. It was a small test, almost trivial, yet it felt loaded. Mike took the call and felt the old impulse to undersell, to throw a discount like a shield between him and accusation. He felt the ancient cord tighten as the old vow whispered its old ethics to him. He touched the wood where the mirror's residue still warmed his palm, breathed the 3 breaths he'd practiced, and answered the client without the habitual softening. "I'll come by," he said, "and I will give you 2 options. We can go premium or basic. Both are honest." The decision, made without fanfare, felt like a small payment toward a different future. Outside, the day slid toward evening. In the garage, the alien rested on a rag, more whole than before, its breathing steady. The leather pouch sat in the drawer, an artifact with a story that threaded far beyond the workbench. Mike had a sense that the next steps, the ritual in full, the tests that would follow, the ripple that might reach Jeff and beyond, would bring temptation as well as relief. He had the mirror. He had the story of a secret base. He had a choice. And for the first time in years, when he looked at his hands, he saw possibility rather than inevitability. He did not perform the ritual because he felt he had to. He did it because he had come to see himself, for the first time in years, as someone whose patterns could be read and perhaps rewritten. The mirror lay on the bench like a small, impatient moon. The alien watched with slow approval, its attention folded into the quiet of the garage. Outside, the desert went on being indifferent. Inside, a man who had made his living shaping wood set his hands where the alien had suggested and breathed. Recognition.
Mike had written the word on a strip of scrap wood and nailed it to the bench where he could not avoid it. He placed his hand over his sternum, fingers splayed the way he'd been taught to check a rung for rot. He named the vow aloud, not as accusation, but as fact. "I have refused prosperity as if it were a danger. I have given my work away to protect others. I have chosen poverty when I thought it kept me from harming those I love." The voice came out quieter than he expected. Saying it fragmented its power. Naming, the alien had explained, cut the cord between unconscious force and the present self. Validation. He did not roll his eyes at the second step. It felt too small for cynicism. He thought of the monk in the habit whose conviction had been pure and fierce. He felt the shape of the vow in its original form: protection, service, fear of corruption. "I honor why this vow was made," he said. "It served once to shield and to purify." His hand rested on his heart, as if pressing a seam, not to mend, but to understand the stitching. In his memory he saw faces, the monk's calm, the scribe's steady hand, and felt gratitude for the moral clarity that had once seemed necessary. Release. The last act must be made with intention. The alien had taught a phrase that read like a reset more than a spell. Mike spoke it, each word deliberate, not because the alien insisted, but because speech had always made things real for him. "I acknowledge the protection this vow offered. I am grateful for its purpose. I now release its hold upon my life so that its intention may be honored without becoming my prison." He breathed the 3 breaths exactly as instructed. Inhale, hold, let go, feeling each as if it were wind passing through a room he'd long kept shuttered. Nothing exploded. The garage did not fill with light. No choir materialized. Change was not cinematic. It was the removal of an old quiet weight.
Where the old routine guilt used to sit, there was a new, surprising clarity. Old impulses still hummed like a background appliance, but the edge had gone. Mike felt, in a way he had not expected, both younger and steadier, as if someone had tightened a clapboard on his ribs and left the house more weatherproof. He spent the next few days like a man testing a repaired window. Small things were the first experiments. He went to a local supply shop and bought a chainsaw he'd been unwilling to afford for years. Standing in the tool aisle, he felt the reflex to rationalize. It's too much. I shouldn't. What if... He remembered the breath, touched his sternum with an almost reflexive hand, and paid for it without trimming the price in his mind. The chainsaw felt, in his hands, less like indulgence and more like equipment for a job he intended to do well. It was a small act, but it registered in the nervous system like a vote. At a Saturday craft fair that followed, he noticed the difference. Where he would have once underpriced to secure a sale, he presented his options plainly and let a new client choose. A young couple who had admired a dining table asked for something larger than their budget. Mike offered a second, simpler option and held his ground on the price for the piece he believed matched their vision. They chose the premium. He signed the invoice with a clean hand and felt the old throat-tightening promise, the one that used to make him give away profit to feel safe, loosen. People remarked on the table's grain. Someone told him it was honest work. It felt like being seen properly. One thing Mike did not admit to himself was that he had also stopped sleeping so well. Old fears, he told himself, needed time to learn their new boundaries. The mirror had cut the power of the vow, but memory was stubborn. He went to the bank that Monday with a small nerve trembling under his skin and a sense like a man testing a bridge they had only recently repaired. Then the contract came. It arrived in a thin, surprising email from an interior firm that handled hospitality accounts. A single line that read like a quiet revelation. Would you be available for a full furniture run on a boutique hotel renovation? They wanted custom beds, desks, lobby seating. The estimate they suggested the next day pushed the figure past anything Mike had ever handled. A number with 5 digits, an 85,000 number that made the back of his head hum. He sat at his bench for a long time. The old script uncoiled its rehearsed lines. This is too big for you. You cannot handle this. You will ruin it and disappoint everyone. Mike felt those voices like drafts under a door, cold and automatic. He put his hand to the mirror as if for blessing, and then wrote out a clear, honest bid. He did what he had always avoided. He called a subcontractor, priced out materials more accurately, and created a timeline that honored the level of craftsmanship they required. He sent the proposal, and then, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine finishing a job of that scale without self-sabotage. The reply arrived like a small miracle and like a test. We'd like to move forward. Can you start in 4 weeks? There was joy, yes, and a pulse of old terror. When the money moved from their escrow account into his business account weeks later, it was an out-of-body moment. He was alone in the evening, the workshop humming with the soft sound of a lamp and the slow grain of wood, when his phone chimed, deposit posted. He opened the banking app. Seeing the numbers was like standing on the edge of a high porch and being offered both the thrill of altitude and the instinct to throw one's arms wide and run into the street. The balance sat there, luminous and improbable. The ancient voice in him hissed the old command, give it away, send the check, distribute it, protect others by making yourself small. The knot in his stomach tightened, and the palms of his hands went cold. He felt old reflexes rise, a mental tally of whom he could shelter with a gesture, the immediate plan to offer a corner of the funds to a cousin who always asked. A sensation that if he kept the money, he would become greedy, mean, unworthy. The first thought was to transfer a large portion out of the account, to give it back to the world as proof he hadn't changed.
The urge felt ancestral. He thought of the monks, of the scribe, of the dying ascetic whose blessing had turned into binding. He recognized the thought for what it was, an old vow surfacing in a new dress. The mirror's lesson had been that naming weakened the command. He took the 3 breaths. He placed his hand over his heart. He spoke the reaffirmation he had used in the garage. I honor the vow's intention. I release its obligation. I will steward this resource with care and service. The instant that he did, the impulse to purge the money loosened like a tight fist suddenly unclenching. It did not disappear entirely. He could locate it again if he wanted, but the urgency, the relentless pressure that had made him act reflexively for years, was now a thing he could choose how to respond to. He set up a separate ledger in a notebook, percentage for payroll, materials, a reserve for unexpected costs, and a modest portion earmarked as a discretionary fund for community support. He would give, yes, but on his terms, and without losing the ability to keep his business afloat. The money in his hands felt less like a burden and more like an instrument. That night, Jeff came over, the table sketches under his arm. "You kept it," Jeff said, peering at the bank notification Mike had shown him. The artist's voice was both delighted and wary. "That's huge." Jeff had his own history of self-sabotage, nights spent agreeing to low-priced commissions to avoid conflict, entire series abandoned for fear of success. Mike told him, without sermon, about the mirror and the ritual and the phrase that had steadied him. He stressed that this was his account, an experience, not a law. Jeff tried the mirror with the careful curiosity of someone who hoped for a better turn and feared the cost. He placed his hand on the glass and after a long minute laughed, then stopped, because the image in the glass was not a joke. He had seen himself once making a promise to be invisible, to avoid attention that might bring harm. He had adopted a poverty of presence that left his art underexposed. The ritual felt like a key he could use to open a different door. "Do you think it would work for me?" Jeff asked. "It might. It isn't a promise, it's a practice. It requires the truth, and it requires follow-through. It asks you to do things differently afterwards." Mike had learned enough to know that new decisions were the real test. He taught Jeff the gestures and the phrasing. They did the 3 breaths together, hands over hearts, like 2 men practicing an old cordial. Jeff's shoulders, usually stooped as if to hide, rose with a small, surprised ease afterward. He went home that night with a handful of possible shows he intended to approach. Days later, Jeff sold 3 pieces to a gallery that had ignored him for years. He used the proceeds, not to throw a party, but to invest in a studio light that allowed him to photograph his work better. The ripple began to look less like magic and more like the steady clearing of an obstructed path. News of Mike's contract spread, in small, honest ways. Word of mouth, a local blog, an interior designer's Instagram post. People liked the authenticity of his work, but the narrative that interested him less and less was the soap of external validation. He found himself more curious about the ethical question that had opened earlier: what to do with a power you had acquired, the knowledge of how to identify and release vows bent towards scarcity. Teaching might help others. Teaching might be risky if mishandled. He did teach, cautiously, to friends and neighbors who were clearly struggling with the same blind habits. He made no claim of universal success. He always attached the alien's caveat: these are experiential practices, not clinical interventions. He insisted on intention, on follow-up accountability, and on seeking professional help when needed. The people who engaged reported a variety of shifts. Some described relief and clearer financial decision-making. Others reported no dramatic change, but a steadier attention to choice. A woman who ran a small catering business stopped offering friends rates that had gutted her profits for years and began paying herself an honest wage. A retiree reclaimed an inherited painting she'd always undervalued and sold it at a modest profit.
using half to fund a home repair. None of it erased life's complications, but the pattern of passive surrender seemed less automatic. All of these small scenes fed into a larger, harder question Mike could not avoid. If such tools existed, who kept them? The alien had been careful in its telling, not an indictment, but a history lesson, and in the quiet hours Mike replayed the image of an underground hall where artifacts hummed faintly in glass cases. He imagined catalog cards, bureaucratic neatness applied to objects that traced desire and destiny. He imagined gloves handling a crystal cylinder, ledger pages listing vows rather than donors. The word secret base kept arriving like an echo. The aliens' claim that powers had long tracked and sometimes hoarded such items felt less like tabloid conspiracy and more like the natural consequence of a world where knowledge is power. One night, under a moon that turned the desert silver, the alien told him more. It communicated not just in images, but in a cadence that felt almost like narration, slowed and considerate.
On many worlds, it conveyed, institutions that think they keep the balance by keeping what they call dangerous knowledge hidden. They imagine the public will misuse it. They fear the upheaval that would follow. Sometimes they are right. Sometimes they hide convenience as virtue. Our people debated whether guardianship or release served life better. Mike listened, the words settling into the grooves of his skepticism. He had no legal interest in exposing an underground hall. He had an ethical interest in ensuring that knowledge, if it could genuinely help, did not become yet another tool for the consolidation of privilege. The alien's testimony, framed as its observation, suggested that secrecy had always had two faces, protection and control. Who decides what must stay hidden, Mike thought? Who touches the dial? The question was corrosive. The alien did not offer a manifesto. It offered a story. Centuries ago, its people had kept a collection of such tools and argued whether to release them. They had made mistakes. They had sometimes hidden items under the assumption that humanity was unready. But the alien also said, almost apologetically, that some custodians had been kind, that some archives were acts of preservation rather than domination. The ambiguity was a moral weight and not a conspiracy headline. There was another tension Mike felt. The more he taught, the more the mirror's influence spread. That felt good in a human sense, but the idea of a cache of such artifacts left unaccountable made him anxious. He imagined a coalition of collectors who might use such tools to nudge political will or to quiet dissent by making prosperity feel scarce. The alien's image of vaults stacked with small devices that recorded vows felt suddenly less abstract and more urgent. He did not know what to do with the idea, besides teach responsibly and insist on transparency when possible. Then came the moment of true pressure, a harsh client who demanded a cut in price after the contract had been negotiated. It arrived when the team was already midway through production and supplies had been ordered. A panic-stricken subcontractor called. The hotel rep hinted that a wrinkle in their budget might require an adjustment. Old reflexes, the compulsion to take the blame, to feign mistake to please, to cut a margin to keep things calm, bubbled to the surface like hot oil. The instinct to surrender profit to preserve relationships was a reflex that had cost Mike more than once. He met with the project manager in a downtown cafe, the scent of espresso like civility. The manager's voice was steady, the manager's problem pragmatic. There's pressure upstairs. The client is asking for a concession. Mike's heart pounded. It would have been easier to cede a small portion and sleep.
But the mirror's lessons had shifted something subtler. He now saw the concession as a decision with ripple effects.
Undervaluing the job would not only jeopardize his livelihood, it would set a precedent that would enable future erosion. He took a breath, touched his sternum beneath the collar of his shirt in a private rehearsal of his rituals, and then spoke plainly about the work's value and the costs already committed. He offered to find savings elsewhere, but refused to take a disproportionate share. The project manager listened, and after a long pause, agreed to absorb part of the adjustment in a line item she had not previously mentioned. It was not a theatrical victory. There was negotiation and compromise, but the moment felt pivotal because Mike had behaved differently, not out of bravado, but by deciding to steward resources in a way that honored both generosity and self-sustainability. He left the cafe with a tired satisfaction and the sense that a new muscle had started to grow in him, a muscle of boundary. The aliens people did not live forever in one place. It told him in the same calm cadence that their own archives had ruptured in cycles. Sometimes release had sparked growth and danger, sometimes secrecy had calcified into greed. The point, the alien suggested, was not to idolize either. The mirror and the ritual, it said, were tools for discerning motive and freeing choice. The human systems that hoarded artifacts did so out of fear, and fear had a way of hardening into control. When the hotel project completed, it did not resemble the overnight transformation stories that populated forums and sensational podcasts. It was a messy, honest success. The crew worked late nights. Some parts were recut to adjust to the budget and maintain quality. The final invoice, when paid, arrived with gratitude and a modest bonus for timeliness. Mike paid his subcontractors ahead a little, invested in a good light for the finishing area, and put a line in his ledger labeled "Sustained Growth." The business was not a boom, it was a steadying. The alien watched all of it with a kind of patient distance. It communicated a plan that would, in its words, allow both of them to make a clean departure. "There are others of my kind," it transmitted. "We do not wish to remain where our presence changes too much, but we will make a beacon when the time comes." The word beacon arrived as image and as intention, a small device that would signal a retrieval team, not necessarily for rescue, but for the aliens' race to collect an injured member and perhaps to take inventory. When the day came for the alien to leave, there was a kind of domestic ritual to it. They packed the leather pouch carefully, wrapped the mirror in a cloth, and slid it into the drawer where he'd first stashed it. The alien, who had been patient and expectedly tender, did not need a grand farewell. It touched the bench with one delicate limb, a gesture like the closing of a book. Mike pressed his palm to the alien's shoulder and felt a warmth like weathered wood after sunlight.
"You saved me," the alien sent, an echo of the first telepathic exchange. It was gratitude distilled. "You asked nothing at first. You asked only to understand. That is rare." They walked to the place where the craft had first come down. Mike had repaired it in small ways, a patched hull, stabilizing bricks of stone. The desert night was wide and clear. Stars slashed through it like threads. The alien laid the beacon on a flat rock. It was small, unassuming, almost a child's toy. It unfolded into a lattice that caught the moonlight. For a long minute nothing happened. Then the lattice pulsed, a soft signal rising up into the sky. The retrieval team, a sweep of shapes Mike could not wholly register, came in silence. The aliens' people did not move like humans. They were efficient and solemn. For a fleeting, sorrowful moment, Mike felt the whole garage as a thin membrane between two worlds. The alien turned to him, and this time its thought came as something almost like a sentence in human words, tender and clear. "Your world contains things we have kept our distance from," it spoke. "We watch, we catalog. We have seen the danger of disclosure and the harm of secrecy. Your people must decide how to steward what they find. We try to offer methods when asked, but the decision to share rests with you." Mike wanted in that instant to ask 1,000 questions about the museum, about vault maps and lists and the names of custodians. Curiosity tugged at him like a child on a sleeve. But the alien's look, patient and a touch mournful, suggested such questions were not the reason it had come. It had come because hospitality had been offered in a desert garage and a life had been shifted. The rest, the alien implied, would require human institutions to do their own moral legwork. They clasped hands, not in a human handshake, but in a contact of intent. The alien's skin was cool as morning metal. Its fingers traced the lines on Mike's palm like someone reading a well-worn map. There was no fanfare. The craft lifted in a quiet that did not startle the coyotes. It rose and vanished like a thought. Afterward, the garage felt fuller for a time, as if the small, luminous absence had left space that had to be re-inhabited by ordinary life. Mike looked at the bench with the strip of wood that read "Recognition" nailed there and laughed softly, a small, honest sound. He had no illusions about exhuming a worldwide conspiracy or storming secret bases. His work was smaller and perhaps more important: to teach stewardship, to help people notice patterns and make intentional choices, to ask institutions and individuals alike to consider who had the right to withhold knowledge that could alter lives. He placed the mirror back in its drawer, this time unwrapping it and looking at its face as an object he would consult, but not worship.
He wrote a short guide on a piece of scrap paper for Jeff and for anyone he taught, a clear, sober outline of the recognition, validation, and release steps, a cautionary note about seeking professional support when trauma or deep pathology appeared, an encouragement to pair the work with practical business practices and accountability partners. He did not include any sensational claims. He called it a practical guide to naming patterns, and left it, folded, in the drawer. Weeks afterward, as his business stabilized into a new rhythm, Mike would think about the alien's story of vaults and custodians whenever he read about another scandal or another buried artifact. The implication that some powers had long kept certain knowledge behind closed doors stopped being a conspiracy to him and became an ethical question: who holds these things and why? He urged friends not to assume malice where patterns might explain delay, and not to romanticize secrecy as virtue. The mirror had taught him nuance. The ripple continued. A neighbor who had always felt compelled to overhelp others finally asked for a fair wage. A local woodworker who had been chronically underbooked started advertising his rates more boldly and found the first month of consistent work in years. Jeff staged a small show and sold enough to set up a modest studio. People told their friends about a man who used a strange mirror to help others name their patterns. It remained, by and large, a quiet story told in living rooms rather than a headline shouted across the internet. Money did not cure everything. It simply stopped being the consistent instrument of his ruin. There were ethical shadows. A woman who had learned the ritual called him wanting to clear a grudging bond with an estranged parent. Mike suggested caution and encouraged therapy alongside spiritual tools. He refused to be the only gatekeeper for the ritual's language and insisted on the alien's caveat: the work is experiential and should not replace professional care. He learned to set boundaries in teaching, recommending support networks and accountability. Once, late at night, he dreamed of the underground hall the alien had described, but the boxes in this dream were not only artifacts, they were diaries, essays, arguments about stewardship. Somewhere between the vaults of secrecy and the blog-filled public square, there was a middle path he found urgent: transparent stewardship, ethical release, and small circles of practice bound by accountability and law rather than by rumor. For the viewers who would one day hear the odd, improbable story, there was one practical thing Mike insisted upon when he told it: do the work locally, with friends you trust, and keep a sober eye. The mirror had opened a door for him,
but the real work was in living differently thereafter.
He learned, through the strain of a contentious contract and the discipline of paying his bills on time, that steady choices mattered more than extraordinary revelations. The alien had offered a method. Mike had discovered that the method became meaningful only when married to consistent, patient action. In the months that followed, he found that his life had room for things he had once thought impossible. He hired an assistant to help with orders, rented a small storage bay to keep raw materials dry through the monsoon season, and, on a cold morning when snow dusted the desert sage, bought a second-hand van that was honest and dependable. He found himself laughing more readily. There was, in his chest, a basic relief that was not selfish but practical. He could meet his obligations and still have energy left to notice the world. He also kept thinking about the ethics of hidden knowledge. If artifacts existed that recorded vows and tendencies, if some custodians on Earth had indeed tracked them, then the argument for radical transparency had to contend with real perils, misused knowledge, opportunism, and, frankly, human error. He found himself counseling friends. Knowledge without stewardship can be a weapon. Stewardship without transparency can be tyranny. It was a sentence he would come to say often because it captured the dilemma. The alien's departure had been quiet, but not final. Several months later, from time to time, Mike would feel a presence in the garage, not an entity, but a residue like a footprint left on the floor. He would touch the mirror and recall the simple steps he'd learned. He taught others to say the phrases not as mantras, but as frameworks. He advised them to pair the practice with ordinary measures, pricing accurately, seeking advice, keeping records. When someone asked him whether the secret base the alien had described was real, Mike had learned to answer in a way that kept both curiosity and caution. "In my experience," he'd say, "there are people who keep things out of view. The alien I met described vaults and guardians. Whether those places are in the deserts of maps or in back offices of institutions, the moral question remains: what do we do with knowledge that can change lives?" He never framed the claim as proof, only as testimony from an encounter that altered his own life. In the end, the most important thing the mirror taught him was humility, that a vow meant to protect could become a chain, and that untying a chain required both respect for the vow's origin and a willingness to act differently thereafter. He kept the leather pouch locked in his drawer, not as treasure hoarding, but as a reminder that with knowledge came responsibility. On a late afternoon when the light turned honey gold through the garage window, Mike walked the project manager through the final punch list on another job. She thanked him the way clients do when a project lands in good hands.
He smiled and felt the old thrum of gratitude that was not edged with shame. The mirror was in the drawer, the chainsaw in the corner, the van warming in the driveway. There was work to be done and bills to be paid, and a life to be lived with a new kind of attention. Before the story folded into the steady hum of his days, he wrote a short note and pinned it to his workbench, a practical, sober guide that outlined the 3 ritual steps and emphasized discernment and professional support if deeper wounds appeared. It was a small civic gesture, not a manifesto. He did not presume to characterize the alien's tale as proof of a global conspiracy. He presented it as testimony that asked for inquiry. The implication that there are archives, custodians, and tendencies toward secrecy is a claim worthy of ethical attention. Whether or not those vaults match the alien's image precisely, the lesson was clear to him. Knowledge is not neutral. Its stewardship demands care. And so his life went on. The creature had left, the lesson had stayed. The secret base remained a possibility, a worrying answer to the question of why certain knowledge might be withheld. But for Mike, the larger change was intimate and practical.
the difference between being moved by fear and being moved by intention. The mirror had shown him his rope. The ritual had taught him how to choose whether to cut it or to untie it gently. He chose to untie, to honor origins, and to walk forward with hands ready to build and eyes open to the ethics of what he now understood. If this story has touched something in you, if you sense a pattern in your life that returns like tide, and you want practical steps to test it, there is a short, carefully written guide in the pinned comment that outlines the recognition, validation, and release steps, and offers resources and cautions about seeking professional support where needed. It's not a promise or a cure. It's an invitation to look, to name, and to act with responsibility. If Mike's story resonates, read it with discernment and share what you learn in the comments, responsibly. The secret base, as he learned, may or may not be as hidden as some say. What mattered most was the decision to steward the knowledge we do find with care.